Okay, so this is my American Lit 2 midterm presentation, and I have chosen the text A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. It is a semi-autobiographical novel published in 1943 about a girl named Francie Nolan who grew up at the turn of the 20th century. There's no right way to really point out a specific plot for this book, mainly because it does just encompass Francie and her adolescent years and her life, but there are a lot of parallels that can be made by the time that this was published and the timeline that it's set in the book. And I'm going to go through some of those, starting with women's suffrage. So for this quote, Johnny is talking with Katie. Johnny and Katie are Francie's parents about voting and politics. It's election time in this scene, and they're talking about what it means for them to vote, and Katie's kind of frustrated with him because he doesn't believe that women will ever vote. So when were women allowed to vote exactly in the United States? So I have my little notes. Technically, women were allowed to vote when the 19th Amendment was ratified. They were granted the right to vote. However, that right was only extended to white women, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a second. So this is the exact date that the 19th Amendment was ratified, and this is just a little blurb from that. It's probably the most famous piece from that legislation. So, did women actually vote after the 19th Amendment was ratified? Yes and no. It took several decades for women to vote, and for them to become, sort of the electoral force that suffragists predicted that they would be at the voting polls. Mainly because women didn't really, or a lot of women rather, didn't really believe that voting and politics were for them. They were still kind of subscribed to the idea that it's just something that is exclusively for men. However, women born, mid 20th century thought it was natural to vote, and that shift can be owed to Black women. Despite voting barriers, they turned out, by the time that it came for them to vote, they turned out at the same rates to white men and probably just a little under white women. So were all women allowed to vote? Again, no. When the 19th Amendment was ratified, it was just white women who were allowed to vote. And then that in itself started, a chain for people of color, but they definitely had to fight for it. So let's get rid of this real quick. Oops. So after that came the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. So that basically granted Native Americans the right to citizenship and the right to vote. However, voter suppression was very prominent, and it allowed individual states to refuse them that right through poll taxes, literary tests, fraud, you name it. The Magnuson Act of 1943 allowed Chinese immigrants and Chinese women the right to vote. They themselves will face their own barriers when it comes to voting. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 allowed Black women to vote. Even now, I feel like voter suppression is the most prominent for the Black community. They also had the hardest time, as Black women specifically, in terms of actually being granted the right to vote. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965, basically just prohibited voting discrimination based on race, color, national origin. A big turning point for the book was when World War I happened. So at the time, Francie was 16 in the book, and she was working for a model printing press. And this was kind of the two moments that shell-shocked her. The one-word headline was 6 inches high, the three letters were smudged at the edges, and the word war seemed to waver. This very much mirrors what was happening in the US at the time, because when this was published, the United States was just thrust into World War II because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And with, war came other things. So women were called to the workforce yet again. It did also happen in World War I, and that can be seen through this moment, this quote in the book. Francie's place of employment shut down and she had to go, find another place of employment. But for World War II, women became electricians, welders. They helped build the weapons that were deemed essential to the war effort. And then food rationing also was a big thing. And this was the quote that reflects that in the book. And I just kind of made a comparison between the types of food that were rationed in World War I and World War II. In World War II, there was a very specific system created for rationing food. There were vouchers for coffee, meat, cheese, canned milk. Every American was entitled to a series of what they called war ration books, and it was filled with stamps that could be used to buy restricted items. And then the OPA, which I believe stands for Official Price Administration, they set the price limit, and each person had so many points. So like 48 blue points for canned, bottled, and dried food, 64 red points for meat, fish, and dairy. A big theme in the book is identity, and I wouldn't say patriotism, but just the feeling and the longing of being American enough. Francie grew up in an immigrant neighborhood to immigrant parents, and this was kind of this scene I feel like really encapsulates that and how special it was to her and to people like her to be seen as truly American. So when this was happening in her classroom, I believe she was the only child there whose parents were born in America and in turn was born in America. And that plays into how identity, race, and nationality affected, sort of this book and what that looked like at the time that this book was published. This is, the quote that I feel like encompasses that. So let's start here. Only a great sprawling place like Brooklyn could there be such a sharp division. It was a neighborhood peopled by fifth and sixth generation Americans, whereas in the Nolan neighborhood, if you could prove you had been born in America, it was equivalent to a Mayflower standing. So in Francie's neighborhood, it again was an immigrant neighborhood. A lot of German immigrants, Irish immigrants, Jewish people were establishing themselves in New York at the time. So if you think about that in terms of what the war did, what World War II did for a certain group of people, and how even though a lot of them were American enough or should have been considered American enough, that all went away as soon as somebody deemed that they looked like the enemy. And I love this quote because it really does capture that the parents were too American, too aware of the rights granted by their Constitution to accept injustices meekly. They could not be bulldozed and exploited, as could the immigrants and the second generation American. So President Franklin Roosevelt decreed Executive Order 9066. I have that here. So that was the removal of Japanese Americans from their communities. their imprisonment, essentially. They were put in internment camps. Nearly 120,000 of them were put in internment camps. And sometimes it wasn't even just Japanese Americans, it was pretty much anybody who looked like they were Japanese American. And this, I believe, is a very famous photo, but it, to me, is one of the most haunting ones from that era. It's a grocery store owned by, a Japanese American man. He was born in America. He even went to the University of California. I believe his store was in Oakland, California. And this was the sign that he put up the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor to kind of show his patriotism and to plead his case early, almost like he could feel what was about to happen. But it didn't matter. They shut down his store and he was still put in an internment camp. Something that really surprised me when I was researching about this book and what was going on at the time was how heavily involved the book industry was during the war and how much they really wanted to support the war effort. So the Council on Books in Wartime is a nonprofit organization founded by bookish people, so booksellers, librarians, publishers, authors, who really wanted to bring books to our troops. I say to the American troops. I was not born, nor was I considered American. But their whole motto and their whole sort of ideal was that they wanted to use books as weapons in the war of ideas. They wanted to influence the American thinking. They wanted to boost morale, kind of keep up the will to win. And in total, they printed about 122,951,031 armed service edition copies at 6 cents per volume. So they were like mass markets, maybe slightly smaller, the size of a smartphone. And the type of paper was basically like newsprint in strength. And 6 cents a volume. I believe that they have gathered that it would take about 6 readings before the book started to fall apart. But soldiers were reading in places that they've never read before. They were reading in trenches. They found books all moldy and muddy and really well loved. It was kind of amazing. And A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was the bestseller at the time. So there were 2 print runs. The first one yielded 52,000. The next one, 76,000. Plenty of soldiers wrote to Betty Smith offering, their thoughts and their feelings and how exactly this book got them through a really difficult time, which is amazing. A lot of them have never even set foot in Brooklyn, but you could just kind of tell that they felt the same tenacity and they wanted to hold on to the idealism the way that Francie did in the book. And that's probably why a lot of them really connected to it. So in terms of how influential it was, I'd say just from the previous slides, it's a pretty influential book. I believe that it did go against societal norms. This book is about a lot of things. You could say it's about the American dream. You could say it's about hope. It's about will. But it's also about generational change. And there were a lot of really strong women figures in this book. And for the most part, their story arcs are just them kind of stepping out of their traditional gender roles and finding other ways so that they could survive in the very hardy world of Brooklyn. But I will leave you with this quote. There's a tree that grows in Brooklyn. Some people call it the tree of heaven. No matter where its seed falls, it makes a tree which struggles to reach the sky. It grows in